Well, kia ora, Grace City. Great to be with you again as we continue the series that we are in probably the earliest part of the New Testament to be written, the letter that was written by an early church leader named James. Last weekend, I was speaking at our Howick and then Flatbush locations, which is Sunday morning and then Sunday night. And in one of those locations, I had a wonderful conversation with one of our longer term members in one of those locations. And he raised this issue with me. He said, I know we're saved by grace, but where do good works then fit into that? He said, I've got some friends who go to another church and they say, well, grace is important, but you have to do good works if you want to be saved. He said, that doesn't sound right to me, but I'm not quite sure how to respond. We had a really, really good conversation. And it's helpful because that's exactly what we're turning to now as we continue through this letter that was written by James almost 2,000 years ago. So we're in James, the second half of James chapter 2 today. And this is really how I want to rephrase that question for us to speak to it today. So here's the question. What part do good works, in other words, what part does living a good life play in the life of a follower of Jesus? What part do good works play in the life of a follower of Jesus? And that's where James comes to next in the second half of James chapter 2. And he's going to speak to this in two ways. Firstly, he's going to speak to this practically because this is a crucial question for the people who are receiving this letter from him. And then he's also going to speak to it theologically. So he's going to call them to live a certain way, to tell them to what to do, and then he's going to explain theologically why he wants them to do that. So he begins practically, and this is really his point in the first 4 verses of this section we're going to look at. Practically, he says, people of faith are to live lives of good works. So that's his real practical point, that people of faith, believers in Jesus, are to live lives of good works. So here's the way he frames that in chapter 2, beginning from verse 14. He says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing to help them their physical needs, well, what good is that? In the same way, he writes, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. Now, we need to remember the context of this letter. So if you've been with us for the last few weeks as we're diving into this, James is one of the early leaders of the church. He was actually the half-brother of Jesus. But during Jesus' ministry, he didn't believe in his older brother. I mean, your older brother's the Messiah, yeah, right. So he doesn't believe until Jesus dies on the cross and rises again from the dead, and he appears specifically to James, 1 Corinthians 15 tells us, and that kind of turns you around a little bit, and James becomes a follower of Jesus, and he becomes what we would call the pastor of the church in Jerusalem over time. So initially, that church was led by the apostles, but as they began to develop a broader, wider ministry, James steps in and becomes the pastor of this church. And then, as we've talked about, persecution hit. And most of the members of his church community get scattered out of Jerusalem to surrounding areas, towns, cities, to escape the persecution they've been going under. And it's horrendously hard. Some of them are traumatized by the circumstances they've had as fellow members of the church have been thrown into prison for their faith in Jesus. So they've run for their lives. They have very little with them. They've got to start over life in a brand new place, get new jobs or start up new businesses, find somewhere to live. And so they're actually really struggling. And then as they settle in a town and kind of get themselves established, they find more members of the Jerusalem church coming and settling there as well. But they're also struggling. They've turned up with nothing. And so they're poor and they're destitute. And so what James's call is, as he's writing to these members of his church who have now gone to other places, as you settle and as you establish yourself, and as others then arrive, you need to be caring for them. So this is a call. Practically what James is wanting is he's wanting the people of his church who, if they are able to care for their brothers and sisters who have very little. That's the call here that James is making as he's writing. Now, as scholars read this part, a number of them look at verses 15 and 16, the scenario that James creates. You know, imagine a brother or sister, they have no clothes, they're without daily food. In other words, they've escaped and they've got the shirt on their back, they've got no wallet, no credit cards, no money in the bank. They're destitute. And they arrive and James says, and so what, you turn around and you say, God bless you, be well. And you walk away. James goes, no, that should never happen. And many scholars say James is creating this hypothetical situation. He's kind of illustrating the point. But I'm not so sure about that. I actually wonder if this is the scenario that's actually taking place in the background of his letter. And James is calling out to his church members, if you're able, wherever you've now gone, if you are able to care for brothers and sisters, if you have that ability, then you need to care for them. That's what it means to love each other. And this is a crucial point. Decades after James wrote, one of the apostles, John, wrote 3 letters, which are also in our New Testament. And this is the way John put it in his first letter, 1 John 3. He said, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or with speech alone, but with actions and in truth. And that's what James is calling for as he's writing this part of his letter. Exactly what John was saying. Don't just say some nice words over someone. If you've got the ability to help, and sometimes we don't, but if you've got the ability to help a brother or a sister, then help them. Give them whatever aid they need. That's what it means to love one another in this family. And James is almost pushing against so hard. He's saying, if your faith doesn't lead you to do that, you need to have a serious look at your faith. That's what he's saying. If we come back to the questions he begins with in verse 14, here's how he opens this. Verse 14, and the way he writes this in the original Greek language, he's writing it, it's clear that as he writes, the answer to his questions, the 2 questions, are negative. So he writes, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? The answer is, that's not good at all. Question, can such faith save them? The answer is no. And so what James is saying is if you have faith in Jesus Christ, as you are able, you need to live out that faith in your good works. That's the expectation that he's creating. Faith in Jesus will always result in a life of good works. And that's what he's calling for in this entire passage. So if I could frame the big idea of this message to fit into this woven series, here's how I would say it. Weave your faith with good works. That's what James is calling for us to do. Weave your faith with good works so that you live it out in a life of action and obedience. Because for James, faith and good works are meant to go together. Now, for some of you, that may start to raise a few alarm bells. Because one of the things we preach here is that we are saved by grace alone, by faith. Our good works don't enter in. And suddenly you're hearing James say, and you're hearing me say, we're meant to weave our faith with our good works. And you're starting to go, hold on, what's going on here? And if they've got a little alarm bell going, that's great. Just hold your alarm for a minute, because I want to keep going in the passage and make it even worse for you. So let's carry on, because what he's doing is he's practically saying to them, hey, if you're a follower of Jesus, a person of faith, you need to live a life of good deeds. Well, now in the rest of the passage, he's now going to explain that theologically. So practically, then theologically. And here's the second point. He says, theologically, genuine faith will always result in a life of good works. Genuine faith will always result in a life of good works. So here's how he gets into that as he begins this section. Verse 18, he says, someone will say, well, you have faith and I have deeds. One person majors on this, another person majors on that, yada, yada, yada. Who cares? And James goes, I care. Actually, this is a big point. He says, show me your faith without deeds, whatever that looks like. I'll show you my faith by my deeds. See, James is saying, arguing they go together. And then in verse 19, he says this, you believe there's one God. Oh, good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. And what James is pushing back on here is an idea that says faith is merely intellectual assent with a group of facts. So, oh yeah, I believe in God. Yeah, I believe Jesus died on the cross. Woohoo. And James is going, actually, our faith definitely includes agreement with some facts, but it's more than just an intellectual exercise. Faith is actually trusting ourselves to the one who died on the cross for us. It's actually committing our lives to him and putting our trust in him and walking with him and following him. And so James is pushing back on the idea that someone can have a faith in God that doesn't really result in any life change. What he's saying is if we put our trust in Jesus and Jesus has poured his Spirit into us, there's going to be change in our lives because these things go together. That's what he's arguing for. And then he moves to give us two examples from the Old Testament of the way that faith and good works end up weaving together. The first example is an obvious one for any Jewish writer who knew the Old Testament well. He goes straight to Father Abraham. Abraham was the father of the Jewish people, a great figure of faith in the Old Testament. His story is told in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And that's what James goes running back to. So he's now going to use Abraham as exhibit A for his thesis that faith and good works need to be woven together. So he begins in verse 20. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Now he's going back to a story towards the end of Abraham's life in Genesis chapter 22. The narrative of Abraham and his wife Sarah is that God called them and they responded, and God made this incredible promise to them. He said he was going to bless them and through them bless the world, and he was going to make a nation come from them, which is the people of Israel. But the big problem was that they were infertile. They'd struggled with infertility, so they'd had years of negative pregnancy tests. And so there's this tension in Abraham's whole story. On one hand, he's got this amazing promise of God, I'm going to make a nation out of you. On the other hand, he's got the stark reality that they're infertile, they can't have kids. And for 25 years, he holds this tension of a promise from God on one hand and the cold, hard facts on the other. And then finally, after 25 years, God blesses them with a son. They name him Isaac, which means laughter. And it's a wonderful story. And Isaac grows up. And then the story comes in Genesis 22, where God now wants to test Abraham's faith. Because they'd waited so long for the birth of this child that the huge temptation might have been that they would so love this gift of God, they would love him more than the giver of that gift. And so Abraham is now tested by God horrifically. The word of God comes to him and says, Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and sacrifice him to me on the mountain I will show you. Now, just to be clear, the God of the Bible hates human sacrifice. He will make that clear as the rest of the Bible is revealed. But Abraham doesn't know that at this point. But the writer, Moses, as he tells us the story, says right up front, okay, this was a test. God was not going to allow Abraham to go through with that, but he's testing Abraham's faith. Abraham responds with complete obedience. Remarkably, he goes to the place, he takes Isaac, he builds an altar, he puts Isaac on it, the knife is poised, and God goes, stop, Abraham, that'll do. I don't want a dead son. I wanted to see if your faith was alive. So that's the story that James is coming back to, this remarkable story of obedience and response to God. And so, if we go back to verse 21, was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Now here's James's summary in the next verse, verse 22. You see that his faith and his actions were working together so that his faith was made complete by what he did. So his faith was lived out in the way that Abraham responded in obedience in good works to what God had said. And then James draws his conclusion, verse 23. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see, a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. Okay, some of you who had alarm bells ringing earlier, they're probably now blaring with red lights flashing. Because what James says in verse 24 is startling. In fact, this is the most controversial part of this letter. A person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. Now, that's a surprise, because what we preach here is that we're saved by God's grace, and that gift of grace is accepted by faith alone, not based on our works. And it feels like James is saying something completely different. And so when you line James up with what the Apostle Paul wrote in a number of parts in the New Testament, there's a real problem. So Paul wrote this in one of his letters to the Romans chapter 3. He wrote, "This righteousness from God is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, for we maintain that a person is justified or declared righteous by faith apart from works of the law." So Paul seems to be saying the exact opposite to James. In fact, just to help bring real clarity, let's put these two verses up on this chart together. So James is writing, we're considered righteous not by what they do, by what they do and not by faith alone. Paul says a person is declared righteous by faith apart from works of the law. So they're using similar words, faith, works, righteous, and it seems like they're saying the exact opposite. And this has been an issue for centuries as scholars and theologians have wrestled with this. So one of the most famous is the German monk Martin Luther. 500 years ago, he led the Protestant Reformation, a towering figure of faith, and he had real problems with James because he championed this idea that we are saved by grace alone when we put our faith alone in Jesus alone, no good works. And then he comes to James and he goes, what the heck? So when he translated, he was the first person to translate the Bible into the German language so that his countrymen could read it. When he translated and released the Bible in German, he put the book of James at the very end. And in fact, he actually advocated for maybe dropping it right out of the Bible because he could not handle it. In fact, here's what he wrote about this letter that we're studying. He said, James's letter is really a letter of straw compared to Paul's, for it has nothing of the nature of the gospel about it. And if you wonder about what he means when he says a letter of straw, think about the three little pigs. You know, the one who builds a house of straw, it just gets blown down by the wolf because it's so flimsy. Whereas the little pig that built the house out of bricks, that's Paul, as far as Martin Luther was concerned. So he has real problems with this because he felt like James and Paul were contradicting, and many people have wrestled with this. I want to suggest today they're not actually contradicting each other. So two reasons. Number one, James isn't contradicting Paul because Paul hasn't written anything yet. Right? When the time is James is writing, he's the first one writing any part of our New Testament. So he's not trying to undermine or contradict what Paul has written because Paul hasn't written anything yet. Paul will write later. But there is still that sense, well, while they seem to be saying quite the opposite. Here's how we need to understand this. They're using similar words, but they're talking about two different aspects of the Christian life. So Paul is writing about, if you imagine a timeline of your life or mine, Paul is talking about how do you enter into a relationship with God? How do you become a Christian? How do you enter into the Christian life? That's what Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 3. James is writing about now that you're a Christian, how do you live out the Christian life? And so they're both looking at the Christian life, but they're looking at two different aspects of it. So Paul was really strong on this. Paul would write in a number of his letters and say that we are sinful people. We have rebelled against God. We've turned our back on our Creator. We've disobeyed His laws, whether we even knew them or not. And since His laws reflect His character, we've basically rejected the character of God. We cannot live up to who God is as this holy being. And the penalty of that, the sentence because of our sin and rebellion against God is death. It's separation from God. And there's nothing that we can do to fix that up. There's nothing that we can do through our good works or our efforts to make up for the fact that we're broken and sinful before God. Even if we could do more good works than bad works to balance them out, which even that is questionable, but even if we did that, the standard of perfection we actually need is perfect holiness. God is utterly holy, which means we've got to be perfect, which means if we've got even one bad deed in the entirety of our lives, and trust me, we've got way more than that, we're in big trouble. And so the message of the New Testament is, by ourselves, we cannot sort out our problem of sin and rebellion against God and the sentence of death that goes with that. And that is why, since we can't fix our problem, God fixed it by sending his son Jesus for us. Jesus, God in the flesh, steps into our world. He lives the perfect life that you and I can't live. He then goes to the cross. He dies on the cross for our sin, rises physically from the dead to defeat sin and death and the curse, so that God now offers through Jesus a gift. If we would not try and work our way to God, because we can't, but if we would just acknowledge our brokenness and accept that gift by putting our faith and trust in Jesus, then we are gifted with this incredible gift of grace. We are given forgiveness. We are adopted into his family. He pours his spirit into us, and we now have life forevermore. And that is the incredible message of the Bible, that we can have a relationship with God that is not based on what we do and can never be earned, but is given to us as a gift that we simply accept by faith. That's how we begin a relationship with God. That's what Paul is describing in Romans chapter 3. James is talking about something different. James would look at what Paul said about how we come into this, and he'd say, Carr, completely agree. What James is saying is that once we've trusted in Jesus, then we are now to live a life where our faith is outworking itself in a life of obedience and action and good works. So that we should be weaving in response to what God has done, we should be weaving faith and good works together. And Paul would look at that and say, Carr, totally agree. That's exactly right. James has got it right. So if we go to another of Paul's letters, in Ephesians, he writes some very well-known words about how to be saved. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, Paul says, it is by grace that you have been saved, through faith. And this is not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. That's what Paul is saying. How do we come into a relationship with God? It's not based on what we do. We can't sort our lives out. It's a gift of God's grace. We accept it by faith alone in Jesus alone. But then in the very next verse, Paul goes on to say this. We often just read verses 8 and 9 together, but here's what he then says in verse 10. For we are God's handiwork, his workmanship, created in relationship with Christ to do what? Good works. To do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. See, Paul is writing here in Ephesians 2 verse 10, he's saying the same thing as James. That we are saved solely by faith, but we're saved for a life of good works. And so having been welcomed into God's family utterly by grace, we're now to weave our faith in with good works and live out our faith in the world around us. So if we can take the big idea that we had earlier and let me just add a little bit more to it. Here's the message that James is getting across to us. Weave your faith with good works, not to be saved, but because you are saved. Weave your faith with good works, not to be saved, but because you are saved. That's the message. And friends, that's why Abraham is exhibit A for James. He brings Abraham into the story because this is exactly Abraham's story. So he took us to Genesis 22, where Abraham, towards the end of his life, faces this huge test from God. And he shows his obedience to God, his willingness to do what God has said. But if you notice, James actually quoted a key statement about Abraham from the book of Genesis. It said, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. But that verse doesn't come from Genesis 22. That verse comes from Genesis 15, years earlier, where Abraham believed this incredible promise that God had made him. See, Abraham, to use New Testament language, Abraham was saved by faith alone. He just believed what God had said. And then as he walks with God over the next probably 40 or 50 years, he works that faith out into a relationship with God so that when God, towards the end of his life, challenges him and tests him, Abraham responds with his amazing obedience, good works, action. See, and so Abraham becomes this amazing example of this idea that we're to weave, once we're saved, we're to weave our faith with good works, not to be saved, but because we are saved. So come back to verse 22 for a minute. It'll come up on the screen. This was the summary that James had written. He wrote, you see that Abraham's faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Now that word complete, James has already used it in James chapter 1. It actually means matured. So James isn't saying that Abraham's faith was inadequate and it needed to be filled up, it needed to be completed. He's saying that James's faith over the ensuing years, it was matured as Abraham learnt to walk with God and live it out. And in that moment in Genesis 22, it reached this peak where he did this incredible act of obedience to God. And that's the call that James is making. And by the way, it comes through in the second example as well. James finishes off in the last two verses by using another figure, Exhibit B from the Old Testament. It's the story of Rahab from the book of Joshua. So he finishes up this way, verse 25, in the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. So Abraham's Exhibit A, Rahab is Exhibit B. So she was this woman in the book of Joshua who shelters the spies that Joshua had sent into the land that God had promised them. And I think James here has been quite deliberate by picking two examples that are the opposite extremes of humanity. So Abraham is this great patriarch. Rahab, as James very overtly says, was a prostitute. Abraham was the father of the Jewish people. Rahab was a Canaanite, which was a horrendous nation, very debauched people that God ended up having to judge. Abraham is this great figure of faith through the Bible. Rahab is this notorious sinner. But what he's saying is the principle holds for both. So wherever you are between an Abraham and a Rahab, it's still true for you too. It's the same principle. And you see, Rahab came to faith alone, but then that worked out through her actions. So in Joshua chapter 2, she shelters these spies that Joshua had sent into the land when they come to the city of Jericho and protects them and sends them on their way. But when she's interacting with them, what's fascinating is here's what she says. I've heard about the God of Israel, Yahweh. I've heard what he's done for the nation of Israel. I've heard about all the amazing things he's done. I've heard he's going to give you this land. She's already come to faith. See, she was saved by faith, but then that faith worked itself out in the way that she responded and lived a life of good works. And that's the call James is giving us, friends. Weave your faith with good works, not to be saved, but because you are saved. I think maybe the most helpful analogy as we finish is toys. Toys are always great for theological analogies. I want to suggest, though, that the way that faith and works operate is kind of like this train and this carriage. Or imagine a truck and trailer, if that's more you. But the engine of the Christian life is always faith. It's faith in God. It's belief and trust in who God is and what he has said. So what James and Paul and all of the New Testament are teaching us is that when we begin a relationship with God, it is utterly by faith. Good works do not play a part in it. We can't fix ourselves. We simply acknowledge our brokenness and we trust in Jesus alone to be saved. But then as we go through the Christian life, faith is still the engine, but our faith now gets joined with good works that follow along. We're not saved by good works, And our good works as we go through life don't add anything to what faith has done. They're simply pulled along by our faith in Jesus as we walk with him. But here's what James is saying. We begin by faith alone. But as we go, good works should follow. And if good works aren't following, then that looks suspicious. That's what James is saying. The Protestant reformers, Luther and others around that time, they ended up coining a phrase to explain this. They said, we are saved by faith in Jesus alone, but we are not saved by a faith that is alone. We're saved by faith in Jesus alone, but not by a faith that is alone. In other words, we believe in Jesus, but then good works end up being part of that as they follow along the life that God calls us to live. And that's James's call, friends. Weave your faith with good works as you walk with Jesus, not in order to be saved, but because you are saved. So as we finish, how do we respond to this and live this out? If you're here and you're exploring what a relationship with God even looks like, maybe you're watching online and you're just joining us for the first time, or you've joined us a few times and you're just checking out, what does this mean? Or maybe you're here with a friend, or you've come by yourself and you just want to explore this. I just want to be crystal clear on this. God, the message of the Bible is don't be a better person, fix your life up, try harder. We can't try harder. The message of the Bible is radically different and so much better than that. It's recognize that you're broken and that you can't change that, but God so loves you that he offers you this incredible gift that we call grace and invites you into a relationship with him that isn't based on what you do. It is totally based on what Jesus has done. And he invites you to simply acknowledge your brokenness and to say, I'm going to trust in what Jesus did for me in his life, his death, and his resurrection. And if you've never taken that step and you want to take that step, you can just do that right in this moment in your heart. Just talk to God in your heart, acknowledge your brokenness and say, I want to trust in Jesus alone. And if you're online and you want more information, please reach out to the online hosts that are there with you. If you're here in the room and you'd love to talk more about this, we'll have a prayer team available up the front here at the end of the service. You can come and chat to Chris or I down the front here. We'd love to chat to you as well. But that's the message if you haven't yet taken that step. For those of us who have, which is most of us in this room, the challenge is to then add good works, to weave a life of obedience and action and good works with our faith out of thankfulness and recognition for all that the grace of God has done. And you know, James here is actually writing really practically. This whole passage is actually about loving people in need, living a life of good deeds when we're able to, that helps people. And so the call is, hey, love people as you're able to. And there's so many ways we can do that, friends. You know, we partner with a wonderful ministry here called Christians Against Poverty, and there's a bin out the front every Sunday where you can just bring a few groceries with you to church and pop them in there. It's just an act of love to support families who really have very little. Alan and Kay, who lead the team out in the cafe there, lead this brilliant ministry called Loaves and Fishes, working among the homeless people of Auckland. And they would always love more volunteers if you're able to do that. But they always will also need warm things for those people, blankets, beanies, gloves. Alan was telling me this morning when I touched base with him, someone turned up today with socks for their ministry to give to someone who's homeless. Isn't that a beautiful, simple way of living out what James is saying? But you can reach out to a friend or a family in need. You can put some food into their pantry. You can cook them a meal. You can babysit for a family just when they need a break. I remember a few years ago when I had cancer diagnosis and had an operation, was recovering at home. We had this lovely gentleman from our Howick congregation who showed up week after week while I was recovering and simply mowed our lawn. That is a beautiful, loving act of weaving faith and good works. And that's the call that James is giving us. If we are followers of Jesus, would we weave our faith with good works, not to be saved, but because we are saved, and we're so profoundly thankful. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for this amazing part of your word. Thank you, Holy Spirit, for inspiring James to write these powerful words that when we understand them fully are such a clarion call for us to live out our faith practically and lovingly as we go through life. Thank you that we do not need to do anything to add to what Jesus has already done for us. Thank you that we are saved by grace alone, through what Jesus has done alone, which we accept by faith alone in him. But thank you that we then get to live out a life in response of good works and obedience and loving others. Would you help us to hear this call and to live in a way that responds to this amazing grace we've been given? We ask this in your name. Amen.